So today we'll be finishing up the book of Jonah. We're in Jonah chapter 4. This is Jonah learns. Jonah learns in this chapter. I've divided it up into two sections, two bite-sized pieces. Verses 1 through 3 I've labeled hot under the collar, which you'll see reason for that in a minute. And verses 4 to 11 I've labeled that learning compassion. Learning compassion. So let's take a look at this. Look at verse 1. It says, "But it greatly displeased Jonah, and he became angry." Well, what is it that greatly displeased Jonah and made him angry? Well, it's because God turned away from punishing Nineveh to blessing them, to saving them, to extending his grace to them. That's what's angering Jonah here, that God has extended grace to these most hated barbarians, these country that's been on the attack against Israel for decades. God has extended his grace and mercy to them, and that makes Jonah angry. Notice in my Bible anyway, angry here is at the end of the sentence. It's the last thought that we're left with here. It literally means hot. That's what the word means, hot. Do you ever feel really mad and you feel like you're kind of boiling sometimes? You're so angry, and you see it in people because they'll often turn red and things. Well, this is going to be kind of an interesting metaphor here as this develops, that he is hot. What's made him hot? Verse 2, "I fled to Tarshish to put this off, to forestall your forgiveness, for I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, and one who relents concerning calamity." So look at that. I mean, Jonah is fleeing from God, not because he's ignorant of God's character, but because he knows God's character. He knows what God will do. And again, full of application in this book that, we who know God's character are sometimes reluctant to carry it out. Knowing full well that God's going to chasten us, we nevertheless flee from him. In verse 2 here, what he's quoting is a verse that is first used in Exodus 34:6, and then is echoed through the Old Testament like a golden chain. If you have a pen handy or a pencil, I want you to jot down some other verses where this appears. If you don't have it handy, you might want to stop the video and come back in a second. Here are those verses: Numbers 14:18, Psalm 86, verse 5 and 15, in Joel chapter 2, verse 13. It's again kind of this golden chain that goes throughout the Old Testament, reminding us of God's mercy. Also, look at verse 3. How repulsive. "Therefore now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for death is better to me than life." He is so repulsed, so repulsed by what God has done that he wants to die. He'd rather die than see Nineveh forgiven. Well, incredible here, an incredible complaint that Jonah is making against God. But before we quickly condemn Jonah's poor attitude, I want you to put yourself in a situation, maybe in your sanctified imagination, where you are sharing the gospel with someone who has done you the most grievous wrong, maybe somebody who has taken money from you, stolen money from you, somebody who has abused you in your marriage. Perhaps even consider a rapist, a child abuser, the worst people that you can imagine. And imagine that after sharing the gospel, they repent. They are saved. Could you rejoice in your salvation? Although Jonah resisted God and argued with God over his extravagant mercy, God used Jonah. Perhaps he would use you in a similar situation. You don't have to rejoice. You don't have to be happy about it, let me say. It would be great if you were. But sometimes just being faithful is enough. Sometimes just doing what God has told you to do and allowing God to be God is just enough, even though you may be reluctant. Perhaps God is calling you to do something today where just being faithful would be enough. Let's go on then. In verses 4 to 11, we see Jonah learning compassion. So I said last time about God is sticking with Jonah because he wants to mature Jonah. We see that maturity going on here. The Lord said in verse 4, "Do you have good reason to be angry?" So God is really just putting his finger right on the problem here. He's asking this rhetorical question. Rhetorical questions are more statements than questions. For example, I might emerge from my bathroom on Sunday morning ready to go to church, and my wife looks at me and she says something like, "Dan, is that what you're wearing?" Well, that's not really a question. That's more of a statement. Well, that's what we see here. This is more of a statement. In other words, God is saying, Jonah, you have no reason to be angry. It says, Jonah went out from the city and sat east of it, and he made a shelter for himself and sat under it in the shade until he could see what was happening in the city. So imagine Jonah going out on a hillside, watching over the city, watching what's going to happen. There's a big plant there, maybe a small tree, and he gets under it for some shade. The Lord appointed a plant, and it grew over Jonah to shade his head, deliver him from discomfort. And Jonah was really happy about the plant, it says in verse 6. But God appointed a worm when dawn came the next day, attacked the plant, and withered it. And the sun came up. God appointed a scorching east wind, and the sun beat down on Jonah's head so that he became faint and begged with all his soul. Jonah was hot under the collar because of God's grace. Now he's hot under the collar again because God has withdrawn his grace in the form of this plant. Notice a couple things here. Again, God uses the created world to carry out his will. And notice also God's verse, in verse 10, God's lesson for Jonah. This is a illustration. The plant is an illustration of the lesson that he wants for Jonah to learn. Jonah's, in other words, saying, Jonah, if you had compassion on a mere plant that is here today and gone tomorrow, how much more compassion should you have for the city of Nineveh? So he's confronting Jonah, and Jonah is learning compassion here. He's learning compassion from God. God compassionately provided a plant for Jonah. God also compassionately provided Jonah for Nineveh. I think one of the takeaways, another takeaway from this chapter is that you and I, having been saved, have to be careful that we don't become resentful or angry when God extends the same compassion to others that he extended to us. We were no great catches, right? We were no great prize, that we were in our sin, that we had to recognize that at some point, and God extended the compassion of forgiveness to us just as he does to others. My mind goes to the story of the prodigal son. And the prodigal son returns, and who has a problem with the return of the prodigal son? It's in fact the faithful brother who had been there all the time. The faithful brother who was wondering why such a big celebration was being thrown for his faithless brother when he had been faithful so often and for so long to his father. And his father explains to him, and this is the voice of God speaking to us, is that there's rejoicing over a sinner who repents in heaven. And that's what we see here. Shouldn't be reluctant to enjoy or recognize the rightness of that rejoicing. So brothers and sisters, I pray that you, again, if you need to repent, that you cause rejoicing in heaven. And I pray that you would not hesitate. And I pray that as you see God also extending grace and mercy to others, that you would also recognize the grace and mercy that he has given you. What a rich book, isn't it? The book of Jonah. It's often a book that's relegated to children's church, the nursery, to tell stories, but really a book rich in lessons about God and his mercy and his graciousness and compassion, rich in lessons about how even faithful believers can slip away and turn back. We don't really drift into holiness. We don't drift into obedience. It has to be pursued. So God bless you. Next time we'll be in the book of Micah. God bless you, brothers and sisters.